A mile beneath the surface of the world's deepest lake, there is ice that burns. You can hold it in your hand, touch a flame to it, and watch it catch fire with a pale blue glow while it drips into water in your palm. The Russians who drilled down and pulled the first chunks up called it fire ice, and there are entire hills of it down there, 6 and 8 meters tall, hiding under a thin coat of mud more than a mile beneath the surface. For years, Russian crews have been going down into this lake, cutting holes through the winter ice, lowering drills, submersibles, and instruments into water so deep that the bottom lies past a full mile down, deeper than any other lake on Earth. And almost every time they reach that floor, they come back up with something that should not be there. The fire ice was only the first thing they found. A mile down, in water so cold and so black that sunlight has never touched it, they found insects, living ones. A kind of fly, in a place where the pressure could fold a submarine, where almost nothing should be able to survive, let alone something that is supposed to live in the air. A mile down, they found the floor of the lake bleeding oil, one slow drop at a time, feeding swarms of life that have never once seen the sun. This is Lake Baikal, and almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. Most people, if they have heard of it at all, picture a big, pretty lake in Siberia, frozen half the year. A place on a map you will never go. That picture is not wrong, exactly. It is just so small that it misses the entire point, because Baikal is not just a lake. By most measures, it is the oldest, deepest, strangest body of fresh water on the planet. And the more closely the Russians have looked at it, the less it has behaved like a lake at all. So let's go down, slowly, from the ice at the top to the rock at the very bottom, because every layer of this place hides something that should not be possible. And by the time we reach the floor, the question will no longer be what is inside Lake Baikal. The question will be what Lake Baikal actually is. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the strangeness begins. Baikal is the deepest lake in the world. At its lowest point, the bottom lies more than 1,600 meters down. That is just past a mile straight down, through nothing but cold, dark water. To put that in human terms, you could sink the tallest building ever made beneath the surface, and it would vanish completely, with hundreds of meters of water still left above it. Most lakes are puddles by comparison. The deepest of the North American Great Lakes does not even come close, but depth is only half of it. Baikal is also old, not old like a few thousand years, old like 25 to 30 million years. It is the most ancient lake in the geological history of the Earth, which means it has been sitting here, holding water, since long before there were modern humans to look at it, since long before there were even recognizable versions of most of the animals alive today. Lakes are not supposed to last that long. They fill in, they dry up, they silt over and become meadows, and then forests. A lake that survives a few 100,000 years is unusual. A lake that survives tens of millions of years is something else entirely. It is practically immortal. And then there is the water itself. Baikal holds around 23,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water. That single lake contains roughly a fifth of all the unfrozen fresh water on the surface of the entire planet. More than all of the North American Great Lakes combined, poured into one crescent-shaped crack in the middle of a continent. If every other source of surface fresh water on Earth somehow disappeared, this one lake in Siberia would still be holding about 20% of what was left. So you have the deepest, the oldest, and one of the single largest reservoirs of fresh water on Earth, all in the same place. That alone would make Baikal worth studying for 100 years. But it is what lives in that water, and what hides beneath it, that turned this lake into one of the most quietly astonishing places on the planet. And to understand any of it, the Russians had to do the one thing that is genuinely hard to do here. They had to go down. Going down into Baikal is not easy, and people have been trying for a long time. Back in 1977, small research submersibles called Pisces were lowered into the lake to take the first close looks at the bottom. In the early 1990s, they came back, this time with an international team, and that is when the first real shock arrived. Studying the shape of the lake floor and the way the ground was structured, scientists came to a conclusion that sounded almost unbelievable. Baikal, they realized, was not a normal lake basin at all. It was a tear in the surface of the planet. The two sides of the lake were slowly pulling apart, spreading away from each other a little more every year, in the same way that the floor of an ocean spreads. The land here was splitting open, and the lake sitting in that crack was, in a sense, the beginning of a brand new ocean. Hold that thought, because we will come back to it at the very end, and it changes everything. In 1997, a different kind of expedition arrived, this time to drill. The Baikal drilling project pushed down into the sediment at the bottom of the lake and pulled up long cores of mud, layer after layer, more than 1,800 meters of core in total, recovered almost perfectly. And buried in that mud, at depths of around 120 and 160 meters below the lake bed, they found something nobody expected to find in a lake. They found gas hidden inside ice, crystals of frozen water with methane trapped inside them. They had just discovered that Lake Baikal contained gas hydrates, the fire ice, and at the time, it was the only freshwater lake on Earth where anyone had ever found them. That discovery quietly rewrote the rules. But cores of mud can only tell you so much. To really understand what was down there, somebody was going to have to put human eyes on the bottom of the lake. And in 2008, that is exactly what happened. The vehicles were called Mir. In Russian, the word means both peace and world. They were a matched pair of deep-diving submersibles, each one a small metal sphere built to carry 3 people down into crushing depths. And they had a remarkable history before they ever touched Baikal. These were the submersibles that had been used to film the wreck of the Titanic on the floor of the Atlantic. They had dived on sunken nuclear submarines. They had gone down to the seabed at the exact geographic North Pole, beneath thick Arctic ice, and found their way back up to a single small patch of open water. Now they were being trucked and flown halfway across the planet to dive into a lake. But the lake nearly broke them, in a way the ocean never had. The Mir submersibles had been designed and weighted for the salty, dense water of the sea. Baikal's water is fresh, which means it is less dense, which means the submersibles were suddenly about 180 kilograms too heavy. In the ocean, they floated correctly. In Baikal, they wanted to sink like stones. The engineers had to strip out heavy equipment and bolt on extra blocks of buoyant foam just to make the vehicles safe to dive. Even getting them onto the water was a problem. There was no proper research ship on the lake, so they converted an old river coal barge with no engine of its own, towed it into position, and used it as a floating platform. Over the summers of 2008 and 2009, the 2 Mir submersibles made more than 120 dives into Lake Baikal. And what they brought back changed the way scientists understood the entire lake. Because the bottom of Baikal turned out not to be a quiet, dead expanse of mud. The bottom of Baikal was alive, and leaking, and in places, on fire in slow motion. The first thing they had to do was find the courage to go down and look. What was waiting for them on the floor had no right to exist in a lake. To understand what the Mir crews saw, you have to first understand the water they had to pass through to get there, because the water column of Baikal is strange in its own right, long before you ever reach the bottom. Start at the very top, in winter, with the ice. For 4 to 5 months of the year, sometimes longer in the north, the entire surface of Baikal freezes solid. The ice can grow more than a meter thick enough to drive a truck across, thick enough that there are official ice roads marked out on it every year. And here is the first quiet miracle. Because of where Baikal sits, the winters are bitterly cold, but not especially snowy, and the wind is fierce. That wind sweeps the snow off the ice, leaving long stretches of it as clear as glass. You can stand on a meter of solid ice and look straight down into black water, as if you were standing on a sheet of dark crystal suspended over an abyss. But the ice does something stranger than just look beautiful. In certain places along the lake, especially over the spots where gas leaks up from below, the methane rising from the bottom gets trapped under the ice and frozen into it as it forms. Bubbles, stacked in frozen columns, locked into the sheet. And every so often, in the dead of a Siberian winter, a fisherman will break a small hole through that ice, hold a match to it, and a column of flame will leap up off the frozen surface of the lake, sometimes the height of a person. Fire, rising out of solid ice, in the middle of one of the coldest places on Earth. The locals have known about this for centuries. The very name Baikal traces back to a phrase that means something close to standing fire. Long before anyone understood methane or gas hydrates, people stood on this lake and watched it burn. So even at the surface, before you go down a single meter, Baikal is telling you that something unusual is leaking up from far below. Now follow that gas downward into the water. The water of Baikal is famous for being almost unbelievably clear. In winter, you can see down through 30 or 40 meters of it, and it is cold, the kind of cold that does not change. At the surface, in summer, the top layer can warm up, but once you sink past about 20 meters, the temperature settles to around 3 degrees above freezing and simply stays there all the way down, a mile deep, year after year. It is, in effect, a permanent deep freeze that happens to be liquid. Now here is the part that genuinely stunned scientists. In most very deep lakes, the deep water is dead water. It sits still, it never mixes with the surface, and the oxygen in it gets used up and never replaced, leaving a lifeless zone in the depths. Baikal does not do this. Somehow, the deep water of Baikal stays rich with oxygen all the way down to the very bottom, more than 1,600 meters down. It is the only deep lake in the world that manages this. And that single fact is the key to everything strange that lives down there, because oxygen at the bottom means complex life can survive at the bottom. While the deep zones of other Great Lakes are near empty, the deep of Baikal is full. The lake found a way to breathe all the way to its floor, and in doing so, it opened the door to an entire hidden world. And that hidden world is where things stop making sense. Before we reach the floor, though, there is something hanging in that dark, clear, oxygen-rich water that has nothing to do with biology at all, something the Russians built on purpose. Because that same water that makes Baikal so unusual, the clearest, deepest, darkest fresh water on the planet, turned out to be perfect for catching one of the most elusive things in all of physics. To explain why, we have to talk about a particle called the neutrino. And to talk about the neutrino, we have to admit something uncomfortable, which is that right now, as you sit here, trillions of them are passing straight through your body every single second. Through your skin, through your bones, through the chair, through the planet, and out the other side. They come from the sun, from exploding stars, from the violent hearts of distant galaxies. They are almost impossibly small. They carry no electric charge, and they barely interact with matter at all, which is why you have never felt a single one. Most of them could pass through a wall of solid lead, a light year thick, without touching anything, which makes them nearly impossible to study, and that is exactly why physicists want them so badly, because a neutrino travels in a straight line. Other cosmic messengers get bent and scrambled by the magnetic fields of the universe on their way to us, so they arrive with their origins erased. A neutrino does not. It comes straight from the thing that made it, whether that is a dying star or a black hole tearing a sun apart. If you could only catch one and trace its path backward, it would point like an arrow straight back to one of the most violent events in the cosmos. The problem has always been the catching. And here is the elegant, almost poetic solution. Once in a great while, a neutrino does collide with something, an atom in a great volume of water, and that collision produces a tiny, faint flash of blue light. So, if you want to catch neutrinos, you do not build a small, sensitive instrument. You take an enormous volume of perfectly clear, perfectly dark water, and you fill it with light detectors, and you wait. You let the water itself be the detector. You need it to be huge, you need it to be transparent, and you need it to be in total darkness so that no other light drowns out those rare, faint flashes. There are only a handful of places on Earth that fit. One is the ice beneath the South Pole, one is the deep Mediterranean Sea, and one is the bottom of Lake Baikal. So, the Russians built a telescope there. Not a telescope that points at the sky, a telescope that hangs in the water and looks downward through the entire Earth, using the planet itself as a filter. They call it the Baikal Gigaton Volume Detector. The way they build it is as strange as the thing itself. Every year, in late winter, while the lake is still frozen solid, teams drive out onto the ice and set up what amounts to a temporary town. They cut holes in the ice, and through those holes, they lower long vertical cables down into the deep, each one strung with dozens of glass spheres. Inside each sphere is a sensitive light detector waiting in the dark. The cables hang down to depths of around 750 to 1,300 meters, anchored to the bottom, floating upright in the black water like the strings of some vast, invisible instrument. Cluster by cluster, year after year, they have been growing it until it now encloses a colossal volume of the lake, an entire region of deep water, wired to listen for ghosts. And it works. Down there in the dark, the detectors wait, and every so often, out of the trillions of neutrinos pouring through, one of them strikes an atom in the water and leaves its faint blue signature, and the machine records the arrival of a messenger that may have begun its journey in the death of a star on the other side of the universe. A lake in Siberia, quietly mapping the most violent corners of the cosmos. It is one of only 3 such instruments on the planet. And yet, as remarkable as it is, the machine hunting the universe was not the strangest thing down there. The strangest things were alive. To find them, you have to keep going down, past the lowest detectors, all the way to the floor. When the mere submersibles finally settled onto the bottom of Lake Baikal, their lights found a landscape nobody had expected. In the central part of the lake, at a place the Russians call Gorovoy Utes, the flat floor gave way to a low rise, and on top of that rise were small, dark, cone-shaped hills, only a meter or 2 high, the color of light brown clay on the outside and darker, like tar, underneath. And out of the tops of these little hills came something extraordinary: pipes. Natural vertical channels in the mounds, and from each one, every 20 or 30 seconds, a single small drop of oil welled up, broke free, and floated slowly upward toward the surface a mile above. The bottom of the lake was bleeding oil, drop by drop, on a clock. A short distance away, the crews watched small spheres of oil, each about the size of a marble, simply forming on the flat lake bed and drifting up on their own. They were watching crude oil seep up out of the sediments of the earth and rise through the water in slow motion. It is estimated that several tons of oil leak naturally into Baikal this way every single year. In almost any other body of water, that would be a catastrophe. A constant leak of oil should poison the place. But Baikal absorbs it because the lake has something living in it that treats the oil and gas not as poison, but as food. And that is the second great shock of the deep. Around those oil seeps and gas vents, where you would expect the most barren, lifeless mud in the lake, the Mir crews instead found life packed shoulder to shoulder. In places, they counted more than 100 animals crowded onto a single square meter of the bottom. Far more life there, in the dark, around the leaking hydrocarbons, than in the ordinary deep zones around them. How is that possible? In total darkness, where not a single photon of sunlight has ever reached to power the food chain. The answer is one of the most profound ideas in biology. The base of this food web is not built on sunlight at all. It is built on bacteria that can take the methane and the chemical energy leaking out of the lake floor and turn it directly into the raw material of life, without any sun involved at all. Everything else, every animal crowded around those seeps, is ultimately feeding off that chemical energy. It is an entire living world that runs not on light, but on the breath of the planet itself, leaking up from below. And then, a few meters away from those bleeding oil mounds, the submersibles came upon the thing this whole story started with, because the floor itself, in places, was made of something that should not exist in a lake. What at first looked like ordinary hills on the lakebed, covered in a thin film of sediment, turned out to be something else entirely. When a mere pilot reached out with the submersible's robotic arm to take a sample of one of these hills, the arm could barely break it. The hill was not made of mud or rock. It was solid and dense and strangely hard. They were looking at hills of gas, hydrate, fire ice, the same substance the drillers had found buried in their cores years earlier, except here it was not buried. Here it was the landscape. In the middle of the lake, at a site called St. Petersburg, the crews found a whole chain of these hills, 6 to 8 meters tall and dozens of meters across, all of them built out of frozen gas. To grasp what these hills actually are, you have to understand what gas hydrate is. Deep in the cold, high-pressure conditions at the bottom of Baikal, water molecules can lock together into a crystal cage, and trapped inside each cage is a molecule of methane. The result looks like dirty ice, but it is ice with a secret. It is packed with gas. When you bring a piece of it up, where the pressure drops and the cage falls apart, it releases an astonishing amount of methane. A single cubic meter of this fire ice can release more than 160 cubic meters of gas as it breaks down. That is why it burns. That is why a chunk of it, lit with a match, flares up while it melts. It is, quite literally, a fuel hidden inside ice. The mere crews learned this the hard way, and the moment is almost cinematic. On one dive, they sampled what they thought was a small, sharp formation on the bottom, and began to rise. At a depth of around 360 meters, as the pressure dropped, the sample suddenly started to release gas. As the submersible climbed higher, the hard structure they had collected fell apart in a cloud of bubbles, and by the time they reached the surface, the solid thing they had grabbed off the lake floor was gone, leaving behind only oil and water. The hill had, in effect, evaporated on the way up. To bring a piece back intact, they had to build a special, sealed container to hold it under pressure. And this is where Baikal goes from being a curiosity to being globally important, because gas hydrates are not just a Siberian oddity. There is thought to be more energy locked up in gas hydrates around the world than in all the conventional natural gas reserves on the planet combined. The trouble is that they normally form deep in the ocean or buried in permafrost, in places that are brutally hard to study. In Baikal, they sit right there on the lake floor, in fresh, clear water within reach of a submersible. The lake became a natural laboratory, a place to study a possible fuel of the future without having to drill into the deep ocean to find it. And to make it stranger still, the fire ice in Baikal comes in a particular crystal form that, for a long time, had never been found naturally anywhere else on Earth in this exact kind of gas mixture. Whatever else this lake is, when it comes to fire ice, it is genuinely one of a kind. But the hills of burning ice were not the final surprise on the bottom of Baikal, because deeper still, where the gas leaks up through the sediments, the submersibles found something that no theory had any room for. Something alive that, by every rule we know, had no business being there. Down at the seeps, in the deepest reaches of the lake, more than 1,300 meters below the surface, the scientists found a small community of creatures clustered around the leaking gas. Some of them made sense. There were amphipods, the small shrimp-like crustaceans that swarm everywhere in this lake, There were worms. There were flatworms, some of them startlingly large. These were strange, but they were the kinds of things you might expect in the deep. And then there were the insects, a mile and more straight down, in permanent darkness. Under pressure that would be lethal to almost anything from the surface, there were aquatic insects living on the bottom of the lake. The adult form of these creatures is a kind of midge, a small, non-biting relative of the fly, the sort of thing you would see hovering over a pond on a summer evening. Except these were not over a pond. These were at the bottom of the deepest lake on Earth. And that raises a question that, to this day, nobody has been able to fully answer. The adult insect has to reach the surface to complete its life cycle, to emerge into the air. So how does an insect that lives a mile underwater, in crushing pressure, manage to travel all that way up through the entire dark water column to the surface, and survive? No one knows for certain. The leading idea is almost beautiful in its simplicity: the bubbles. The same bubbles of methane that constantly rise from the seeps may carry the insects up with them, like tiny elevators of gas, lifting them out of the abyss and toward the light they have never seen. An insect hitching a ride to the surface on the breath of the planet. It is the kind of thing you would expect from an alien world, not a Siberian lake. And it is just one of dozens of riddles that this place keeps producing. Because the deep of Baikal is, in a very real sense, its own private planet. Remember, this is the one deep lake on Earth with oxygen all the way to the bottom, and that single fact has allowed life to colonize the abyss in ways seen almost nowhere else in fresh water. The lake is sometimes called the Galapagos of Russia, and the nickname is earned. Out of the thousands of species that live here, a huge fraction live nowhere else on the planet. They evolved here, in isolation, over millions of years, and the result is a parade of creatures that seem to have been imported from the deep ocean and dropped into a lake. Take the fish that dominate the open deep water, the ones the Russians call golomyanka. They look like something hauled up from the bottom of the sea. Their bodies are translucent, almost glassy, with no scales and no real color, because they live in perpetual darkness, where color is pointless. They have tiny eyes and large mouths, well suited to a black world where you grab whatever drifts past, including, sometimes, each other. Nearly a third of their body is oil, so full of it that in the old days people would dry these fish and burn them like candles. They have no swim bladder, which would be a fatal liability for a creature that travels up and down through that immense water column every day, since a gas-filled bladder would crush or burst with the changing pressure. And rather than laying eggs, they give birth to live young. Almost every feature of this fish is borrowed from the deep ocean, and yet here it is, the dominant fish of a freshwater lake, the deepest living freshwater fish in the world. Then there are the scavengers, and this is where Baikal develops a darker reputation. The lake is home to more than 350 different kinds of amphipods, those small crustaceans, almost all of them found nowhere else, where a normal lake might have 2 or 3, and down in the deep, they form an astonishingly efficient cleanup crew. There is a grim local legend that the Russian mafia favored Baikal for disposing of bodies, because after a couple of days in the lake, there is essentially nothing left. When scientists actually tested the idea, lowering baited traps to the deep floor, they found the legend was not far off. In well under 2 days, some traps were stripped completely bare, and the rest were swarming with hundreds of these small scavengers, each one only about a centimeter long, the size of a grain of rice-shaped pasta, that had found the bait in the dark and consumed nearly everything in it. The lake, it turns out, keeps itself astonishingly clean, in part because almost nothing edible lasts very long once it reaches the bottom. And, as in the deep ocean, the cold and the oxygen-rich water of Baikal have produced their own giants. There is a flatworm down there that grows to 30 or 40 centimeters long and glides across the lake floor like a flying carpet, undulating over the mud, when its relatives in ordinary lakes are only a few centimeters across. There is the only exclusively freshwater seal in the world living here, the nerpa, an animal that, by all logic, should be in the Arctic Ocean hundreds of kilometers away, and how its ancestors ever found their way into a landlocked Siberian lake remains an open question. The leading guess is that they swam up the rivers long ago and never left. Every one of these creatures is a small mystery. Together, they make the deep of Baikal feel less like part of our world and more like a glimpse of another one. And the deeper you go, the more it feels that way, right down to vents in the floor that breathe warm water into the cold. Scattered across the bottom of Baikal, the explorers found hot springs, hydrothermal vents, where warm, mineral-rich fluid seeps up out of the lake floor. The same basic phenomenon that creates the famous black smokers on the floor of the ocean. But Baikal's version is its own creature. In the deep sea, the fluid roaring out of those vents can be hotter than 400 degrees, hot enough to melt metal, blasting up through tall mineral chimneys in black, scalding plumes. Baikal's vents are gentler. The warmest fluid coming out of them is only around 16 degrees. Which sounds cool until you remember that the water all around it sits at a steady 3 degrees. There are no towering black chimneys here, no scalding plumes. Instead, the vents sit on soft ground, blanketed in mats of the same chemical-eating bacteria that power the seeps, white and pale sponges growing low across the bottom, small crustaceans, flatworms. And living right there, at the warm vents, the Russians found a fish that appears to have adapted specifically to this strange environment, a sculpin that was only fairly recently described and given a name that nods to the heat it lives beside. A fish that seems to belong to the vents in a lake in Siberia, sustained by bacteria that turn chemicals into life in the total absence of the sun. The deep ocean has spent decades amazing us with these chemical-powered worlds. Baikal has been quietly running its own version the entire time, in fresh water, where no textbook said it should be. So that is the descent, from the burning ice on the surface, down through the clearest deep water in the world, past a telescope hunting the cosmos, to a floor that bleeds oil, breathes methane, grows hills of fire, ice, and shelters insects and fish that belong to another world. You would think that would be the bottom of the story, but it is not, because beneath the floor of the lake lies the strangest layer of all, and to reach it, we have to drill. When that 1997 expedition pushed its drill down through the lake bed, it did not just find fire ice. It found something far older and, in its own way, far more valuable. It found a record. Beneath the floor of Baikal lies an almost unimaginable thickness of sediment, mud that has been settling here, grain by grain, for the entire 2.5 million year life of the lake. In places, that layer of sediment is around 7 kilometers deep. 7 vertical kilometers of accumulated history pressed into the bottom of the crack in the earth. And because Baikal is so ancient and so undisturbed, that sediment is a near continuous diary of the planet's climate, stretching back millions of years. Unlike many high-latitude lakes, Baikal was never scraped clean by advancing sheets of ice. Its record was never erased. Layer by layer, the lake recorded the warm periods and the cold periods, the wet times and the dry times, written in the kinds of microscopic life that thrived in each era and then sank to the bottom to be buried. Scientists from Russia, the United States, and Japan worked together to pull up these cores and read them like pages, and what they recovered was a detailed account of how the climate of the heart of a continent has shifted over enormous spans of time, the kind of record that exists almost nowhere else on land. Most of what we know about ancient climate comes from the oceans. Baikal offered something rare, a deep, continuous record from the middle of a continent, far from any sea. So the lake is not only the deepest and the oldest and one of the largest, it is also one of the planet's great archives, holding millions of years of the Earth's memory in the mud beneath its floor. But there is a reason that mud is so deep, and a reason this whole lake is so old, and so deep, and so strange. And it is the same reason. It is the thing the Pisces submersibles glimpsed back in the early 1990s, the thing I asked you to hold in your mind. To finally understand Baikal, you have to stop thinking of it as a lake at all. Lake Baikal sits in a rift, a place where the crust of the earth is being pulled apart from beneath. The continent here is splitting, slowly, two great blocks of the planet's surface drawing away from each other, and the gap between them is sinking and filling with water. That is why Baikal is so deep. It is not a basin scooped out by ice, or a valley dammed by rock. It is a wound in the surface of the planet, and the lake is simply water that has gathered in the wound. The rift floor, when you account for all that sediment, lies an extraordinary distance below the surface, making this one of the deepest continental rifts anywhere on Earth. And the split is not finished. It is happening right now. Every year, the two sides of Baikal pull a little further apart. The fault zones around the lake are alive. Earthquakes shake the region. Hot springs leak up through the cracks. This is a landscape in motion, and the lake is getting wider and deeper with time, rather than filling in the way an ordinary lake would. That is the secret to its impossible age. Most lakes die because they fill with sediment and disappear. Baikal cannot fill in because the ground beneath it keeps dropping away. The crack keeps opening faster than the mud can fill it. Just how alive this rift still is became clear only recently, when an autonomous robot was sent gliding along the bottom near the northern part of the lake. There, the robot's cameras found fields of mud volcanoes, places where slurries of mud and gas erupt up out of the lake floor, scarring the bottom, some of them showing signs of very recent activity. They sat unsettlingly close to a major fault line, and to the scientists studying them, those fresh eruptions were a clear signal. The fault is not dead. The fault is alive. The ground beneath Baikal is still cracking, still shifting, still venting the breath of the deep earth into the cold water above. Whole hillsides of the lake floor, they discovered, were densely covered in these mud volcanoes, in places they had no right to form. The lake is not a finished thing, sitting quietly in the landscape. It is an event still in progress. And here is the conclusion that follows, the one that reframes everything we have just descended through. When scientists trace this rift forward, into the deep future, they reach an astonishing prediction. The crack is widening like the floor of an ocean spreads. The two sides are separating the way two continents separate when a new sea is born between them. Which means that Lake Baikal may not really be a lake at all. In the long run, it may be an ocean in its earliest infancy, the very first chapter of the story by which a continent breaks in two and a new ocean basin opens up between the pieces. Given enough time, millions upon millions of years, this body of water could keep widening until it reaches the sea and joins the world ocean, splitting Asia in the process. We are not looking at a lake. We are looking at the birth of an ocean, caught in its first few million years, frozen in our brief human moment like a single photograph of something far too slow for us to watch. That is what Russia found, drilling down into the deepest lake in the world. Not one discovery, but a whole vertical world of them, stacked from the burning ice at the top to the splitting rock at the bottom. Fire that rises out of frozen water. A telescope sunk into the dark to catch ghosts from dying stars. Oil that bleeds from the floor and feeds life that has never seen the sun. Hills of fuel hidden inside ice. Insects living a mile down where no insect should survive. Fish and seals and giants that wandered in from another world and never left. Millions of years of the planet's memory pressed into the mud. And beneath all of it, a continent quietly tearing itself in half. And the lake is still keeping secrets. There is a legend, told around Baikal for generations, that somewhere on the bottom rests a fortune in gold. More than 1,000 tons of it, the treasure of the last Russian Tsar, said to have gone down with a train that broke through the ice during the chaos of the revolution a century ago. For a long time it was just a story. But not long ago, explorers in a submersible reported finding rectangular blocks resting on the lake floor at the southern end, blocks with a strange metallic sheen to them. They reached out with the submersible's robotic arm to grab one, and the arm failed. The blocks are still down there, whatever they are, waiting in the dark for someone to come back. That is the thing about Lake Baikal. The deeper you look, the stranger it gets, and every answer it gives up seems to come wrapped around another question. How did the insects learn to ride the bubbles up? How did the seal find its way in? What exactly are those blocks on the floor? And how long until the crack finishes opening and the lake stops being a lake at all? We do not know yet. But that is exactly what makes this place so extraordinary. It is the oldest water on Earth and a brand new ocean at the same time. It is frozen on top and burning underneath. It is the deepest, clearest, quietest lake in the world, and it is one of the loudest mysteries on the planet, still cracking open a little more with every passing year, and we are only just beginning to understand what is down there.